her talk is What Do You Want to Be When You Grow Up? Finding Your Fit in Industry. Dr. Martin earned her PhD in biological and health psychology from the University of Pittsburgh, where she studied the impact of olfactory cues on cigarette craving using fMRI technology. Since graduating, Dr. Martin has worked in several different roles, including as a behavioral health consultant and research data analysis consultant, a research scientist, and a UX researcher. She's currently working as a senior behavioral scientist at Innovation Ochsner Health. I know I saw Dr. Martin. There she is. Let me just bring you over. Perhaps. Okay. Did you have slides that you wanted to share?
Yeah, I have them ready whenever.
Awesome. We're ready when you are. Thank you so much for being here. We're so excited to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you guys. And can everyone hear me okay?
We can.
Okay, great. I'm going to share my screen and then share my slides because I have learned the hard way that that is the best way to do it. All right. Can you all see my slides?
We can see your slides. I'm going to bring your picture back in. Okay, great. Take it away.
Awesome. Up. And actually, this is not the right place for them to be. Give me 1 second. You would think that this far into working from home, I would have this down pat, but every time it's a little different. All right. Awesome. Let's try that again. All right. Hopefully you're seeing just my main slide, right?
Yes, we are. Looks great.
Okay, great.
Looks great.
Awesome. Great. So I am really excited to talk to you all. I actually saw a panel from individuals in industry my 3rd year of graduate school, which kind of catapulted me into even understanding what my career could look like outside of industry. So I'm super excited about this. And yeah, currently I work at Ochsner Health. They're located in Louisiana, but I work remote, so I'm actually in Pittsburgh. So I'm a big fan of road mapping out a talk, and I just wanted to kind of go through what I'm going to talk about so that you guys know what's coming up. The first thing I'm actually going to do is ask you all what you want to know from me. I have slides laid out about what I'm hoping to talk about, but I really want to know what your questions are, because I remember having so many questions depending on where I was at my journey into industry. And so I want to cover that first. And then I'm going to go through some questions that others have asked me at various times that actually still feel very relevant and helpful for me. I was able to catch the tail end of the previous session, and I just want to echo the idea that a lot of self-reflection is part of this journey, and you'll see that in the questions that I talk about. Then I talked about my journey, what I did and what I do currently. I wanted to go over some things I've learned along the way. There are many opportunities to learn when you're going from academia to industry, and I want to share the things that have stuck out to me over my journey. And then I'm hoping I can answer your questions along the way, but if that's not the case, I want to make sure that we get back to them. So I'm actually going to just start typing questions if you guys are willing to share them with me.
Yeah, so if anyone would like to drop some questions in the chat, please feel free. And if anyone in the audience has a question, I'm happy to facilitate that. We've heard, while people are entering those, we've heard repeatedly today how important networking is. We've heard repeatedly how important it is to tailor everything to the specific company or position. So if you want to speak more on that, we'd be happy to hear more about that. I would also, given the title of your talk and you mentioning this idea of introspection, I think it can feel a bit overwhelming as an academic to think, how do I know what is going to be the right fit for me?
Yeah.
that's where I would leave. We have one question in the chat that asks, how long were you searching and applying before you landed your first industry position? And how can you give a good informational interview? So perhaps you can
Awesome.
touch on those as well.
Great. Yeah. I am super excited. Some of these I have in there, some of them we can definitely talk about. So great. I'm going to go ahead and reshare my screen then. All right, great. So some questions that others have asked me at various times. One of them is very recent. And so I started my position at Ochsner about 7 months ago. My supervisor actually started a few weeks after me. Her and I have been kind of getting up to speed, learning what our group does. And over time, generally you'll talk with your supervisor, just like your advisor, about what you want to do, but that conversation hadn't come up, for a while for us. We were still learning about each other and our own roles. And so a few months ago, actually, she asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I kind of laughed and told her I was still figuring that out. And she said that was a good answer and that that's something she wants me to keep thinking about. And so I wanted to bring that up to you all because I have a position I really like. I think it's a position I'll keep growing into, but it is still a position where I need to ask myself what I'm doing sometimes, what I want to do, and how I want to grow. The second question is one that came during my dissertation. So I'm not sure how far along everyone is. You guys probably know people who are in their dissertation phase if you're not yourself. And my research assistant at the time, we spent a lot of time together doing scans for the data we were collecting. And I was in one of those places where I was just ready to be done with the work I was doing. And he looked at me very deadpan and said, "Is there anything you like about what you're doing?" And it was a really important moment of introspection for me, because at the time I was really ready to be done with graduate school. I didn't know what was coming next, but it made me sit and think, okay, in my day to day, what is it that I like doing? Do I enjoy running participants? Do I enjoy teaching? How do I feel about data analysis? What are the day-to-day things that I might want to seek out in a job? Because I still didn't really know what industry looked like. And so I'll come back to these two when we talk about your questions, but I want to make it clear that I think that finding your fit really is a kind of continuous journey, and you'll figure out along the way what parts of it are important for you, and those may not be the same thing that your colleague feels is important. And over time, what you feel is important is also likely to change. So I'm not sure if anyone currently feels like this at all. I think I expected that academia would be a very straightforward path from what I understood from undergrad. You finished undergrad and then you went to grad school, and then sometimes you did a postdoc. Sometimes you got lucky and got a spot kind of immediately as a researcher or a teacher, whatever your kind of preference was. And then you'd get tenure, and then you kind of just keep going. I think I learned that straight shot path is not for everyone. And in fact, the longer I've been outside of my degree, the more I have learned that many people do not follow that path. Sometimes they leave, they go to industry, they'll come back to academia. That is a possibility. Or they'll be in academia for quite a while and then leave and go to industry. And then there are paths that are in between. You might teach for a while, you might go to a nonprofit. I'm going to show you what my actual journey looked like in a second, and you're going to realize it looks a lot more like this sketch of reality rather than the expectations. So that hasn't changed since I moved to industry. So this is what my journey looks like on paper, right? This is what my elevator pitch is. This is what my CV or resume might look like, with some tailoring, obviously. But I did my degree at UF. I worked for a year at the Institute of Child Health Policy as a research assistant. I got my graduate degree at the University of Pittsburgh. While I was there, I had an opportunity to do an internship that was industry focused at UPMC. I worked with UPMC up until I left and finished my degree. And then my partner and I actually moved to Seattle. the first role that I had in Seattle was at a nonprofit called Sage Bionetworks. I was a researcher there, and I actually brought a behavior change lens and ideas from behavior change from health space into data sharing, which is what Sage Bionetworks is interested in, kind of helping researchers share their data in a way that helps move the science forward, but is also equitable, respects things like patient consent. I was there for about a year, and then I actually really discovered that I missed working in the health space. And my next role was as a UX researcher in a health division of ZS Associates, which is a managerial consulting firm. So I was a consulting UX researcher for projects focused on health, which often meant I was working with pharma clients. That kind of work-life balance was not exactly what I needed. Being a consultant, especially at a larger consulting firm, can be very stressful. And so I ended up deciding that I needed a different path. And I ended up actually finding my current position at Ochsner Health, which has some similarities to UPMC. They are a hospital system as well as a healthcare provider. And so it's more medical focused and much more focused on behavior change for things like chronic conditions, behaviors we know people want to modify. So that's what I explain to people when I tell them what I did. And that's true. I did hit all of those landmarks. This is what my actual journey looked like, because this is the actuality of life. When you explain your journey on paper, you can explain it in a way that is cohesive, but there are probably points at which you made decisions not necessarily because it was how you had planned it. So I did go to UF for psychology as an undergraduate, but when I started, I wanted to be an addictions counselor. I learned in about a year and a half that that wasn't right for me and switched to more pharmacology neuroscience. When I graduated with my degree, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, but I also needed to pay my bills. And so I looked for a researcher position in an area that I was interested in. But for me at the time, it was much more about, okay, I need some more time to figure out what I need, and I need to be able to pay my bills. I was there for a year and was surrounded by amazing researchers. Some of the research work I got to do at iChip with the team is actually very relevant to my work now, which never ceases to amaze me. There's a lot of times when you will reflect on work you did and see how it was useful, even when you didn't know it was going to be useful. I was not positive about grad school, but it felt like the right next step. And so I applied to programs I was interested in and was accepted at the University of Pittsburgh. And I was really stressed out during a lot of graduate school. It was one of the toughest experiences I went through, but it was also a place where I learned a lot about myself. I learned that I didn't want to stay in academia. The work-life balance didn't feel right for me. The kind of inability sometimes to pick things about your life, such as where you might live, or when you might decide to start a family, or other things like that, didn't feel right. So I wasn't sure I wanted to stay in academia, but I wasn't sure what else there was. And like I said, I went to a panel where we talked about individuals in the room who had their PhDs and were in industry. And that was the first time I even knew that was possible. One of those individuals is actually Dr. Ellen Beckjord, who's at UPMC. And I had the chance to work with her team for that year that I was interning with them. So again, sometimes these panels can really be useful. That was the only way I would have found out about her team. You'll see there's kind of a circle and some branches off. I worked at UPMC for a year during my internship and then left for Seattle. But when I was leaving UPMC and finishing up my degree, they were putting in a contract for me to work as a consultant. UPMC is quite a large organization, and sometimes those consulting contracts can take a really long time. And by a really long time, I mean 6 months. So that was kind of working, but I didn't know when it was going to come through. I really kind of needed a break. I was applying for jobs, but also still needed to pay bills, which is where that picture of pitas comes in. During college and before that, I always worked in the restaurant industry. So I kind of fell back to that. And it was a good chance to take a break for me, because I think I really needed some time outside of a formal working environment to reset. I also did an internship in UX for 3 months the summer after I moved. And that'll be something we can talk about too, this idea of sometimes you can try things on for a short period of time, like an internship. I was very fortunate in that one was paid, which was important for me. I also did some consulting work around that time for a company in Seattle. So we can also talk about freelance consulting if you guys would like. But all of those things were kind of happening while I was looking for a more permanent position, which is what I found at Sage Bionetworks. And then COVID happened, and I really missed working in the health space and decided that I wanted to look for a position there. And actually also went home to Florida, which is where I'm from, for about 2 months. So I left Sage without a backup. I knew I needed to go home for a little bit of time. I came back, and when I was looking for other jobs, actually worked at a dog bakery. And that probably sounds insane, but there's a very lucrative business and dog birthday cakes in Seattle, Washington, if you're curious at all. I also kept consulting during that time. I tutored for a little bit. And then I found a position that I was really excited about, doing UX research with a boutique consulting firm. That was not ZS. The company I applied to and got accepted to was acquired by ZS the week or so before I started. That's that little picture of the merger up at the top. I mentioned that, and I'll talk about it again later, but things in industry sometimes change very abruptly. Sometimes your manager may not be who you interviewed with by the time you get there. Companies merge, companies change. Unfortunately, things like layoffs happen. It's a very different kind of situation than in a lot of academic positions. And I don't say that to scare anyone, but just so that you know that things might change more quickly than we've been brought up being used to in the academic culture. I knew that ZX was not the culture I wanted. My partner actually worked at one of the larger managerial consulting firms when he got his data science degree. And it's just not kind of the amount of work that I think either of us are interested in having due to our work-life balance. And so I looked for another position, or I started to, and that's when I found the position at Ochsner. And right now, like I said, I'm a senior behavioral scientist. Our group kind of functions almost as a think tank within Ochsner. So we get a chance to like play in the sense that we're trying to figure out how to make patients' lives better, their caretakers' lives better, how to reduce costs, and also improve health outcomes. So that's kind of the intersection of our work. And so that's what my actual journey was. Obviously not what I'm going to put on my resume, but I wanted you guys to understand kind of what it actually looks like, which brings me to some of the things that I've learned throughout that time. The first one is that having a PhD or having a master's or even having your bachelor's, those educational milestones open doors, but you still have to be the one who makes it clear that those skills are relevant. And I was looking at the programming you guys had. It sounds like you talked about that earlier today, and I'm definitely happy to touch on it more, but I think it's really important that we know that the skills we gained in our programs are directly applicable. It might not always feel like it, and it might take you seeing what that actually looks like to understand. But for example, if you've managed research assistants or recruited participants or worked between two advisors, you have some skills that a project manager would write down on their resume. And those aren't things that I understood at the time. I didn't really value or understand all of the skills I had gained, but you have them, they're there. All of the roles that I've had have taught me something. I don't list them all on my CV or my resume for a specific role because you want it to be tailored. And honestly, at some point you will start to run out of space, but there are ways that you can speak to those experiences. You can include them in a skills section on your resume if they're more technical. You can bring them up during interviews. You can put them in your cover letter. I would try to make it clear as you're thinking through what you're doing. Don't ever discount something as being not useful because it's not on your resume or CV. This one is a big one for me, and that's you have to learn what it is that is important to you and drives you. And that's where my research assistant during my dissertation, his question comes to mind for me pretty routinely. It's not just about your job or your output or your title. It's about what you need as a person. And that can be everything from where you need to live to how much money you need to make to who you interact with on a daily cadence. I think it's really important to think about those needs because in academia, you may not always have as much freedom or choice or may not feel as if you do. And industry is so different in some senses that it can feel like you don't have a choice in a different way. I mentioned this a little bit before, but industry moves quickly and changes quickly. And that's been something I've experienced kind of throughout the entire time I've transitioned into industry roles. And an example that I want to give about this is I remember getting ready to wrap up my program and a professor got in the elevator and he knew I was getting ready to be done. And he said, "Do you have a job lined up?" And this was about a month and a half before I was going to defend. And I was like, "No." And he said, "Oh." And then like we got to his floor and he got to the elevator and I was like freaking out. And I think it's because at least, in more traditional academic paths, you know your next steps a little bit further out. Whereas in industry, a job position likely is not going to open up any sooner than 2 weeks after the person who has decided to leave that role has decided to leave that role. And that is being extremely generous. The reality is it's really hard to post jobs. I've kind of learned that now, seeing how hard it is for us to sometimes get job postings. So you're not going to know as far in advance as someone who stays in academia what your next step might be, and that's okay. And then some of the technical stuff, which sounds like are the things you guys are more interested in talking about. Networking is extremely, extremely important. I don't love networking. I have had to practice it quite a bit. The thing that has been the most useful for me is understanding how to have an exit strategy at a networking event. And so what I mean by that is you don't want to spend the entire time talking to one person as much as you may kind of meet someone and click. The whole point is kind of meet more people, understand kind of where they sit, what their roles are. And so I literally practiced working on my exit strategy line, which was waiting until the conversation got to kind of a natural lull and then saying, "Well, I really, really enjoyed this. If it's okay, I would love to get your card so that we can connect." And then you kind of move on to talking to the next person. Roles that you might consider might be very different than you might expect. I know for myself, when I left my program, I did not think that I would ever go into UX or user research. And not because I don't like it, I clearly like it enough to do it still in some ways, but I just didn't know about that. And I didn't think that I was someone who could do that because my understanding of UX research was qualitative work, and I was very heavily a quantitative researcher. So I think trying to keep an open mind about what your role might look like or what it might be called. The application and interview process. I definitely want to talk a little bit more about the informational interview that someone mentioned because I'd like to know a little bit more detail on what type of interview they're talking about. But the application process can be long. I know that was one of the other questions. I started applying to roles probably 4 months before I would have been able to work in them. So before I wrapped up my degree, I don't think I got a single reply during that period of time. And I probably was applying to like 1 or 2 per week. Looking back, I think I understand a few reasons why, one of which being that my start date was too far out for them. I was saying I couldn't start for 4 months or 3 months, and they needed someone yesterday. The other thing is I was not tailoring my resume. I didn't have time, and I thought it was fine to just throw it out into the wild. And I think I've learned that really, if you are passionate about a job, take the time to tailor it. I also wasn't having other people review my materials, which was a big mistake. So if you have colleagues that are in industry or even just colleagues who are interested in kind of helping you, have them look over your materials. The interview process, I think we can talk a lot more about specifics about that in a moment, but definitely prepare, definitely know what type of interview you might be getting into. So an interview for a behavioral scientist is going to look very different than a data scientist. That's going to look very different than a UX researcher. I've never personally interviewed for data science, but my partner was in that field, so I can talk at length about what it looked like from outside, not the actual experience, but I can talk about what different interviews I've been in have been like. Also, always send a thank you email after your interview to people you spoke to. Salaries and negotiation. Negotiation is still awkward for me. I have forced myself to do it. It has been beneficial. It has increased the amount of money I have gotten when starting a job, which is important because your base salary is the basis for any bonuses or raises you're going to get. Salaries are something that I know, at least initially, I felt very strange about asking people about. And even now, I still feel a little odd about doing it when someone I don't know. So I've started asking, is it okay if I were to ask you about your salary? Because there are times it is beneficial to know how much others are making so that you do not undersell yourself, which I think is something that happens very routinely, especially when you're coming from academia. We don't understand our value always. And I also want to talk about job hopping because I've had several roles and I haven't been out of grad school for very long. And I've had other people ask me, has anyone ever said anything about that? I think I've had one person use that term, and he actually was using it it was funny because I explained kind of my path to him and he said, oh, okay, well, that makes me feel a lot better that you're not job hopping. So I think people understand that when you come out of a PhD program and you're starting to work in industry, that you may be trying things on. And there's a big difference, I think, between leaving after maybe like 2 months because of a toxic work environment versus leaving after a year and a half because you've realized that the job sounded like it was great, but it really is not meeting what you needed in several ways. So I think just understanding why you might be leaving a job and how you might talk through it in a way that makes it clear what of your needs were not being served and how the new position, hopefully, that you're applying for would serve those better.
Dr. Martin, we have about 2 more minutes left of your time. I feel like we could stay here all evening talking with you. You've given so many great tips and pointers and things we hadn't actually heard yet. So thank you so much.
Awesome.
I don't know if there is anything you want to just close with, but we'd love to hear that. So please go ahead.
Okay, I'm gonna maybe try to do 4 and 5 quickly. So how do you know what the right fit is gonna be? I think it's gonna change over time. I think you will have hints or know clearly if it is not the right fit. And I think it's important to listen to that. And then if that's the case, start to plan how you might find a different role. And understand what you might not be happy with in your current role that you would want to be different. The person who asked about the informational interview, I'm curious if you could elaborate any, or if I've been able to answer that for you.
We've heard from several people today about the importance of using informational interviews as a way to glean knowledge about positions and different job requirements and things. So I'm not certain if they were asking, what specific questions or whatnot, but perhaps they can drop that in the chat and maybe they could connect with you perhaps and ask additional questions.
Yeah, I'm absolutely happy to connect with anyone after this as well. I would say that it's a cliche, but what I've asked people when I'm doing informational interviews is what they would tell their less knowledgeable self that they didn't know they needed to know. Like what would you go back and tell yourself?
That's a great question. I think we will end with that. If y'all will please help me in thanking Dr. Martin. It was such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys so much.
Okay, we are going to close out our day with one final session. Let's see if I can get this